I'd like to welcome you. I'm Barbara Davis, the co-director of the Westchester County Historical Society. We are thrilled to have Marc Cheshire with us to do this program. This was the result of our concentration this year on the 100th anniversary of the first park system in America, that being the Westchester Park System and the Westchester Park Commission. And because Croton, I feel, of all the parks, probably has the most abundant history, the longest history, I thought it would be really great to have Marc, who is an expert on all things Croton. He is the village historian for Croton on Hudson. He's also a board member of the Rochambeau Odell Headquarters House, and he serves on the Revolutionary War 250 our RW 250 board for the County of Westchester. He comes to all this history with a great background in publishing and other things, but mostly literary field. So we're very pleased that he has taken this sort of route around to settle into Westchester's history. And he will be now talking about the history of Croton Point Park. Again, once we're finished, feel free to unmute or use the chat box to ask questions. And Marc, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Yes, when I first moved to Croton, my next door neighbor later became the village historian. Her family had deep roots in the Croton, and she got me hooked on the local history when she told me that a Native American grave had been discovered at the end of the driveway. Because I was actually in the house she had grown up in, and she and her husband had built a modern house next door. And so that kind of got me interested in the local history. Yes, anyway. So let me get started. Let me figure out how I need to share my screen. Okay. All right, you all see that? Okay. Can everyone hear me and see this?
Yep, we're all good.
All right, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with an overview of the major changes that Croton Point has undergone since the 19th century, because it's undergone quite a lot. And it'll help sort of understand everything going on. This was the point as it was in 1890. This area was called the Neck, sometimes called Enoch's Neck. And even more than 130 years ago, it had already undergone its first major change, which was the construction of the Hudson River Railroad. That required digging a valley 70 feet deep all the way across the neck of Croton Point. This is the main portion of Croton Point. Originally, it was called Teller's Point. William and Sarah Teller operated a trading post on the southern tip in the late 17th century, hence the names Teller's Point, and on some old maps, Sarah's Point. Between the two areas was a large marsh. And the two areas were connected by a thin strip of land, just a narrow sandy beach that was on the northern side of the marsh. This little feature was known as Money Island or Money Hill, and it was said to be the place where Captain Kidd buried some of his treasure. Other than the railroad going through, though, this is what Croton Point looked like for hundreds, if not thousands of years. During the Native American occupation, the colonialization by the Dutch and later the British, and the development of the Underhill family vineyards and brickyards. So this shows how it looked 53 years later. We see the Harmon Yards, the major railroad yard that was, by the time it was fully constructed, including a roundhouse. Much of this has been changed over the years, but this is what it looked like in 1943. And Sorry, there we go. And we see lots of filling in the marsh along the tracks. By this point, in 1943, by this point, Westchester County had long since purchased the land that was not owned by the railroad to create Croton Point Park. And this is a relatively recent satellite photo. The roundhouse is gone. The land was sold to build what's called the Half Moon Bay condominium complex along the river. And here is where the marsh has been filled in. Sadly, the marsh became a county dump. And what we see here is the dump after it was closed and capped because of environmental concerns. And this is also a portion that was part of the dump where they dumped garbage as well. That's also a capped landfill. So going back, hundreds, if not thousands of years, this is a detail from a map of Lenape settlements along the Hudson River in about 1600, showing Croton Point jutting out into the Hudson River. Much of what we know about the Native American occupation of Croton Point comes from the 1899 fieldwork of the archaeologist Mark Raymond Harrington, who was a prodigy since he was only 17 years old when he did his fieldwork in 1899. He wrote at the time that the point, quote, consists of two distinct parts, the outer, which we may call Croton Point proper, and the inner, known as Croton Neck. Croton Point proper was originally a long, slender plateau of gravel and clay, pointed at the ends, connected with Croton Neck by a reedy marsh and a narrow strip of beach. It is thought that Croton Point proper may have been an island at some time in the past, and indeed on some very old maps it's shown as an island. A more ideal spot for aboriginal habitation could hardly be found. A great body of water, then teeming with fish and oysters, several springs, adjacent hunting grounds, village sites easily defended yet flat for cultivation, and a freshwater stream leading back inland close at hand. And he's referring to the Croton River, shown here on this map as the Kitchewonk River. What Harrington found on the neck were the, quote, unmistakable traces of an old fort. This is a drawing by Theodore Cornu looking north from the marsh on Croton Point, imagining what it looked like when the Lenape lived there. Cornu was an artist, expert outdoorsman, and early environmentalist who lived in the ferry house at Van Cortlandt Manor when it was still a private home in the early 20th century. This image is from his extraordinary hand-drawn, hand-lettered, self-published journal, Hudson Valley Echoes. In this image, we can see the end of the neck on the upper right and what is called Money Island or Money Hill next to it. Here's a map from Harrington's fieldwork showing the top of the bluff near the entrance of the park where the model airplane field is today. I've rotated it so it's now north to south. Here, Harrington discovered the remains of a stockaded settlement and a dozen burial mounds. He excavated the mounds and found several skeletons, though a few of the mounds were empty. This is a depiction of a stockaded settlement similar to the traces of what Harrington found. This map also shows the location of Money Island in the marsh to the west of the neck. This Harrington photo shows a large oyster midden, a refuse heap left by the Lenape. If you go out to Croton Point today, particularly the northern tip, you can still see oyster middens and oyster shells scattered all over the shore. The oldest ones date back more than 4,000 years. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian has arrowheads, spear points, and other artifacts collected by Harrington on Croton Point, or given to him by the Underhill and Van Cortlandt families. And by the way, if you don't know it, there is a division of the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian at the southern tip of Manhattan, which I finally got to in the last few months, and I highly recommend going. So these are some of the other artifacts that he found or was given that were collected from Croton Point, including this deerskin pouch that belonged to Pierre Van Cortlandt that the family gave him. In addition to being an important Native American site, Croton Point was also the place where a pivotal event in the Revolutionary War took place: the betrayal of General Benedict Arnold and the capture and execution of British Major John Andre. The full story is much too complicated to recount today, but here's a Cliff Notes version. Andre was brought up from New York City on the British ship Vulture. The plan was for Andre to be rowed ashore near Haverstraw to meet Arnold and get the plans for West Point. He would then be rowed back to the Vulture, sail back to British-occupied New York City. Luckily, Americans spotted the British ship, and two soldiers, one of them an African-American named John Peterson, dragged a cannon out to the point and started firing. The Vulture was forced to cut anchor and sail downstream, abandoning Andre. By the way, this drawing was done by Andre himself, who was quite an accomplished artist, as he awaited execution after he was captured. This map shows where the action took place. The Vulture was anchored roughly where in the area of the anchor. The cannon was fired from Croton Point, marked by the arrow on the right, and the left arrow marks the place where Andre was rowed ashore to meet Arnold. With the Vulture gone, Benedict Arnold improvised a plan for Andre to change out of his uniform into civilian clothes, hide the documents in his boots, take the ferry from Stony Point to Verplanck, and go make his way down through Westchester back to British lines. This is the actual pass that Arnold gave to Andre to get through the American lines under the name John Anderson. Andre managed to make his way south until he was captured in Tarrytown. Luckily, one of the three captors could read and understood what was going on. This is one of the actual documents that he had in his boots, written by Benedict Arnold, describing the fortifications of West Point. All of these documents are in the New York State Museum, and there's a possibility that they may be coming back to Westchester next year. So Benedict Arnold managed to escape before the Americans uncovered the plot. Ironically, he escaped on the same ship, the Vulture, which had come back upstream. Andre was tried as a spy because he was captured out of uniform. He was hanged across the river in Tappan. This plaque on Croton Point commemorates where the famous event unfolded, and it honors the two soldiers who fired on the Vulture. This is the grave of John Peterson at Bethel Cemetery in Croton. His friend and fellow soldier Moses Sherwood is buried in Sparta Cemetery in Ossining. In addition to its archaeological and historical importance, Croton Point has its own myths and legends. Many of the stories involve Money Island, also called Money Hill. The name dates back to at least the mid-19th century because it's identified by name on an 1867 map, although it appears as an unlabeled feature on maps dating back to the Revolutionary War. Among the stories told about Money Island was that it was the place where Captain Kidd buried some of his fabled treasure. The idea is not as fanciful as it may seem, because the real Captain Kidd, the privateer whose exploits were the basis for the legend, lived in New York City as early as 1691. He lived on Wall Street, a Turkish carpet on his parlor floor, casks of Madeira wine in his cellar, wrote the New York Times journalist William Broad in a 2008 article about the apparent discovery of the wreck of one of Kidd's ships. His tall house had scrolled dormers and fluted chimneys, which ships seeking New York moorage sought out as landmarks. A family man with 2 daughters, he owned a pew at Trinity Church. The real Kidd did bury some treasure on Gardiner's Island at the tip of eastern Long Island in 1699, giving credence to stories of similar treasure hidden along the Hudson River. This is a photo from Harrington's archaeological fieldwork looking north in the Croton Point marsh. The neck is on the right and Money Island is on the left. In addition to tales of Kidd's treasure, told up and down the Hudson in the 18th and 19th centuries, the odd shape of Money Island and reports that Spanish coins had been found there contributed to the legend. An 1894 newspaper article described Money Island as, quote, almost the shape of an old-time sugar loaf. Covered densely with trees, this hill or mountain is known as Money Island, and Captain Kidd is said to have chosen this spot as a nice place in which to bury some of his countless wealth. Many trustings, not to say credulous persons, have laborious dug in this mound after that treasure, and it is probably as good a place for digging, if one is fond of that kind of exercise, as any spot in the county. 2 years later, in 1896, another newspaper article on the charms of Croton Point revealed that not only was it believed that the pirate buried treasure here, but also that the treasure was guarded by satanic influence. And many were the tales told of strange adventures in support of this idea. These tales were recorded and illustrated by a journalist in Ossining named Frank H. Pearson, an illustrated manuscript called The Tales from Crawbucky Point. This is the location of Crawbucky Point, which was then a sandbank jutting out into the river below the point. Here's a detail of an 1875 survey of the mouth of the Croton River, showing the fishing shack that once existed on Crawbucky Point. So his manuscript, The Crawbucky Tales, collects the stories told by the shad fishermen who gathered on the Hudson River as they sat in their shanties on Crawbucky Beach, waiting for the tide to turn so they could haul in their nets. They entertained each other with ghost stories and Revolutionary War tales. Pearson wrote down the stories, illustrating them with original watercolors. They are a charming reminder of old-time Westchester, when the arrival of spring along the Hudson River was signaled by the cry, "The shad are running." My research indicates that Pearson collected the stories in the late 19th century. He was born in 1856 and began working as a journalist in 1876. I found 2 newspaper articles from 1894 and 1896 issues of the New York Tribune, which have versions of Crawbucky tales. Unfortunately, as was common at that time, neither article has a byline, but I suspect that Pearson wrote them because the article, language in the tales is almost exactly the way he wrote them down in his manuscript. The manuscript includes this map of Croton Point and Crawbucky, where most of the tales take place. One of them, The Bewitched Mill, tells the story of an old woman living in Sparta, which is just south of Ossining, who was said to be a witch. Every piece of bad luck that happened in the community was invariably laid at the door of this particular old woman, Pearson wrote. Nor were there men wanting who would have made oath that on some dark, tempestuous night, the wind coming down from old High Tor in gusts strong enough to take you off your feet, they had seen her pass by right in the very teeth of the storm, riding astride of a broom, bound for Money Island on Croton Point, there to attend a meeting of witches from all the country round, for whom the place was a favorite retreat. Another story, Uncle Ben and the Pot of Gold, begins with a wonderful description of the shad fishermen and crawbucky fish house in what Pearson calls the mid-Victorian age. The crews were composed not only of members from the immediate vicinity, but with men from the backcountry, from Teatown, Spring Valley, Mount Airy, and the Dugway, some of whose fathers and grandfathers had fished these waters before them. One night, Money Hill came up for discussion. An old timer asserted that Captain Kidd had buried some of his treasure there, that it was under satanic influence, and to prove his assertion, he tells the story of Uncle Ben and the pot of gold. Late one night, Uncle Ben is in his boat near Money Island. He goes ashore at Money Island to fill the jug with water. When he returns, he notices something odd in the water off the shore. And when he investigates, he discovers what looks like a large iron pot. Peering inside, he finds to his astonishment and delight that it's filled with gold coins. Then he remembers that it was said that he who would secure any of Kidd's treasure must first have a tug with him of the cloven foot. So Uncle Ben decides to get help before touching the pot. He marks the location, rows home to Sing Sing, and rouses one of his sons. But alas, despite a most thorough search, neither the pot nor money was ever to be found. So in the 1800s, Croton Point became the site of an important vineyard and large brickmaking operation. The vineyards were started by Robert Underhill, who was born in what is now called Yorktown, our Yorktown, in 1761, and died on Croton Point in 1829. He acquired the point in 2 transactions in 1804. And after some largely unsuccessful attempts to grow grapes, his son Richard took over. The vineyard began to be successful in 1827, and eventually it covered 75 acres of Croton Point, and for some years supplied all the large markets of the region with grapes. Among other of the Underhill ventures was the growing of castor beans, plums, quinces, and apples. During the War of 1812, a supply of watermelons to New York City from the south was cut off. So Robert Underhill planted 80 acres of watermelons. It's said that as many as 6 vessels were lying off Croton Point at one time, waiting for the watermelons to mature so they could load them up and rush them back to make a big profit selling them in New York City. The arrow shows the Italianate villa built by Richard T. Underhill at the southern tip of Croton Point. How significant were the Underhill vineyards? In his multi-volume History of Wine in America, Thomas Penny said the Underhills were, quote, the first dynasty in American viticulture. The scale and long life of their vineyards give them a claim to be the real founders of the wine-going industry in New York State. In 1864, a magazine wrote, among grape growers and vine dressers, Dr. Underhill has become a patriarch and a man of renown. The grapes of Croton Point have long ago become celebrated for their richness and lusciousness. Dr. Underhill is a benefactor of his age. His Croton Point vineyards will be a lasting monument to his fame. Thousands of baskets of rich grapes find their way into the mansions of our citizens, followed, when the grape season is over, by thousands of casks of wine. This is one of the many medals awarded to Richard Underhill for his grapes by the American Institute in New York City. This was from 1847. And these are 2 trade cards advertising the sale of the remaining Underhill wine after Richard's death in 1871. His heirs they were all Quakers, and his heirs were teetotalers, and it took years to convince them to sell the remaining wine. So it sat in the wine cellars for a number of years after his death until they could finally agree to sell them. This is a rare photo showing the entrance to the Underhill estate on the southern portion of the point. The building on the right still exists, and the arrow shows a bit of the original house that was built by Robert Underhill in the early 1800s when he first bought the point. This is a photo of the house in the 1950s before it was eventually torn down. And this is another view of the house. This is a photo looking up the river from the southern tip, at the southern tip of Croton Point. And in the middle is Richard Underhill's mansion, Interwasser. Interwasser means between the waters, meaning between the waters of the Hudson and the mouth of the Croton River. It was built partly of marble from the quarry at Sing Sing Prison and became a well-known landmark for people sailing up the Hudson. It even appears in Sanford Robinson Gifford's 1866 painting, Hook Mountain near Nyack on the Hudson. You can see Interwasser peeking out of the trees. Unfortunately, other than grapevines that are now growing wild on the point, the only real evidence of the vineyards are the wine cellars. This shows the vaulted interior of one of them, but for decades they've been boarded up or wired up so that you can't go inside them. There are actually three large interconnected wine cellars buried in the hillside. During the same period that the vineyards were in operation and extending into the early 20th century was a brickmaking operation on the northern tip, shown in this 1869 painting by Julie Hart Beers called Hudson River at Croton Point. These are the drying sheds for the brickmaking operation. William A. Underhill, Richard Underhill's brother, established the brickyard in 1830 during the boom in the brickmaking business on the Hudson River. An extensive clay deposits on the northern portion of the point, and they continued south into the area where the large parking lot is today. There was the Underhill operation steam shovel that would dig out all the clay. And this was a locomotive that they used to pull cars around to go into the brickmaking operation to the molds to be molded and then fired and dried. And these were the large drying sheds. On the chimney of this one, you may not be able to see it that well, are the initials WAU for William A. Underhill. This is an ad from a brickmaking publication called The Clay Worker. The manufacturer, W.E. Talcott, who made this brickmaking machine, was related to the Underhills by marriage and lived in Croton. And he was involved in the brickmaking business, both making this machine and also in the brickmaking operation on Croton Point. The initials IXL stood for IXL at brickmaking. And these are the two ways Underhill bricks were marked, IXL on the right and WAU for William A. Underhill on the left. And you still see them all over the shores of Croton Point today. Richard died in 1871 on Croton Point, and his brother William died unexpectedly 2 years later on a trip to New York City. The vineyard closed after Richard's death, but the brickmaking continued. This order for dynamite is dated from 1895, soon before the operation closed, as the brickmaking industry in the Hudson Valley declined. You see that this is made out to Charles K. Ryder. And if you know, there's a place called Dynamite Road in Ossining, which is where Ryder had his dynamite operation, where he sold dynamite. In the 1890s, Croton Point became a popular spot for canoeing and other types of recreation. The American Canoe Association and other groups began to hold events there. A 1905 article in Country Life in America magazine explains why. One can feel as far away from civilization as upon an Adirondack lake, but a short row or paddle takes one across the river to catch a train, mail a letter, or receive or send telegrams. Camping is restricted to the shores of Croton Bay, but well-behaved visitors may roam over the point at will. A network of creeks enters the southern side, and one of these cuts the point almost in two. At half tide, by portaging a couple of 100 feet, one can pass through Croton Point down to the mouth of the Croton River without going outside into the Hudson. This is a magazine article that depicted one of the races that was held at Croton Point. This is a view out in the Hudson River. And this is a map from one of their publications showing the various routes and award ribbon from the 1894 meet that they had there. Another recreational use was swimming, and the private Croton Point Club was started about 1900. A clubhouse and bathhouses and bungalows were built along the beach on the north side of Croton Point in the area where the beach is today. Here's some photographs of some of the activities. So the other activity that went on was that the point was Point Pleasant Park, which was opened about 1812 on the southern tip of Croton Point. Large excursion boats from New York City would bring visitors who would spend the day strolling around the grounds and have picnics. The Underhill Mansion was turned into a hotel and restaurant, and people would have picnics on the grounds. The park was one of dozens along the Hudson, catering to people from the New York City area. Families, fraternal and religious organizations, and even members of the Socialist Party, to get out of the heat of the city in the summer, would get on excursion boats from Brooklyn, from Yonkers, from Manhattan, and would come up and spend the day at one of these pleasure parks like this one along the Hudson River. In 1923, the Hudson River Development Company opened the Croton Point Beach on the northern side of the point, complete with some amusement rides. This photo is from 1928. By the 1920s and 30s, many people were arriving by automobile and enjoying the water along the beach, where this again is where the beach is today. Starting in the 1930s, privately owned summer bungalows were built on the remaining portion of Enoch's Neck. The community received mail. You see the mailboxes here. There was a small store, and there was even a firehouse, since the Croton Fire Department was so far away. In the 1930s and 1940s, the community published a mimeograph newsletter. During World War II, it was filled with information about servicemen. I guess many, fathers and sons who had grown up spending their summers out on Croton Point went off to war. The colony was ended by the colony and the railroad, which each owned portions of the land, between 1958 and 1963, and all of the bungalow buildings were torn down. In the 1920s, Westchester County was booming, and the Parks Department was developing parks and nature preserves across the county. A civic group had long advocated that Westchester County acquire Croton Point and preserve its natural beauty and historic sites. On January 2, 1924, the county purchased Croton Point and began making plans for developing the land. Parts of Croton Point were in bad shape. One historian said, for 15 or 20 years before World War I, Croton Point was anybody's stepchild. During the war, it became perilously near becoming the site of enormous factory plants. Some areas were covered with the decaying remains of the brick operation. In 1926, an international planning conference was held at Croton Point Park, where county officials stated, Croton Point is destined to become one of the greatest inland bathing beaches and recreation centers in the state. To say that parks provide places of recreation is not to give them the credit they deserve. Wherever a park is established, the character of the neighborhood is fixed on a higher plane. It becomes more desirable for residential purposes. Home builders and owners are attracted, causing real estate values to rise and taxes to increase. The western portion and northern sections of the county need a new recreation center. In the future, New York City's Riverside Drive will be extended as far as the Bear Mountain Bridge. This is one of the plans for developing the beach area, but the county planners had even more grandiose ideas. They wanted to build Playland West to complement the original Playland in Rye. There would be amusement park rides, swimming pools, boating, and more. They began cleaning up Croton Point, but a major obstacle to development was the thin beach area on the north side of the marsh and the narrow access bridge across the Harmon Yards. The county tried to negotiate with the railroad to build a major bridge over the Harmon Yards, but they could never come to terms. So the county abandoned their grand plans, scaled them way back, and cleaned up the site. This is a before view of the main beach, and then after it was cleaned up. This is from one of the County Parks Department publications. Except for the beach area, the rest of the park was kept fairly rustic and used for a wide variety of recreational activities. Girl Scouts camped there. Other children came there to camp and to participate in sports. To improve access to the park, the county began to fill in the marsh on the north side. One of the consequences was the end of Money Island. At the end of 1924, the county asked for bids to remove Money Island, here called Money Hill, and to use the sand and gravel to fill in part of the marsh. 47 bids were received, and the project was widely covered in the press because of the tales of treasure. The following year, Money Island was gone, and no treasure was discovered, at least no treasure that we know about. And there was a clause in the contract that if any treasure was found, it belonged to the county. When you drive by the Croton Harmon station on Route 9, it's hard to imagine how much the landscape has changed. This is an 1856 map showing the original route through Croton Point of the Hudson River Railroad. So this area was called the Cut Through Croton Point. An early guidebook to the Hudson River said, "Here is an extensive excavation through sand and gravel for nearly half a mile. More than 400,000 cubic yards of earth were removed from this cutting. That was just the beginning." This is a view looking south with Croton Point jutting out to the right. The buildings in the foreground were part of another brickmaking operation on the shores of Haverstraw Bay in Croton. The arrow shows the original cut for the railroad through Croton Point. Everything between these two arrows, all of which was basically sand and gravel, was eventually removed to build the Harmon Yards and later Route 9. This photo in roughly 1898 gives you a sense of the scale of what they had to do when they dug that original cut through Croton Point. And the Harmon Yards were built in 1907 and became a major facility when the line was electrified to Croton in 1914. The area where the buildings are was originally sand and gravel, as tall as this hill shown in the background. Even the bank of sand shown in this photo was later removed all the way to where the model airplane field is today. In the early days of aviation, Croton Point was a popular stop for seaplanes, which could land in the usually placid waters of Haverstraw Bay, where the beach area is on the north side of Croton Point. The famous aviator Glenn Curtis landed there and is said to be the person sitting on the top of this biplane. In 1929, there was a growing need in Westchester for a larger municipal airport and a float plane base. Since the grand plans for Playland West would never be possible, the county considered Croton Point. Engineers from 6 American cities and Lufthansa German Airlines came to Croton Point to study the area and make recommendations to the county. Germany had already built airports and float plane bases near the Baltic Sea with conditions similar to Croton Point. The report suggested several phases. First, dredging and filling in the tidal marshes. Second, building a drainage system. And third, building the runways, administration building, float plane ramps, hangars, and space for large commercial and military planes. When this flyer was printed in 1936, the issue was still under consideration. Although the airport was never built, there was a seaplane base in the 1940s, and this envelope commemorates that seaplane base. In the 1930s, the county began using the marsh at Croton Point as a local and then county dump. This aerial photo from 1954 shows the dump as it was gradually filling in the marsh. By the late 1970s, there would be a steady stream of trucks every day. Dumping the county garbage, and it just went on, and the smell was terrible, and seagulls, there were thousands of seagulls that would come to pick over the garbage as it was exposed. The county originally pitched the dumping as, quote, landfill for park purposes. But all that came to an end in the late 1980s as a result of a federal lawsuit. In 1988, the New York Times wrote, after 50 years as the site of an active county dump, the area is judged by environmentalists to be a health hazard. A federal judge last month called the landfill, which was closed in 1986, an environmental time bomb. When it closed, the dump contained 10.4 million cubic yards of rotting garbage. The dumping was stopped and the long process of capping the dump began. This area view gives you an idea of how much of the marsh was affected. The landfill closure required 550,000 square yards to be covered with a special plastic liner, and the installation of more than 1 million square yards of protective geotextile fabric. More than 5.5 miles of gas collection piping were connected to 113 gas extraction wells to extract the methane from the rotting garbage. In the end, the capping required more than 225,000 cubic yards of granular fill the earth to go on top of the protective cover, and more than 100,000 cubic yards of topsoil. Today, it's what locals call Garbage Hill. Although you wouldn't, you have no idea really when you're looking at it. It's a beautiful place to walk and to jog. Also, it's a fabulous place to go bird watching. A lot of species of birds come and use the grassland that's now grown on the top, in addition to the marsh that's still left down below. And you can still see remaining signs of the vineyard, in the brickmaking operation. These buildings still exist at the top of the area where the campground is today. There are thousands of discarded bricks called clinkers on the shore. Here's one of the IXL bricks, but you'll find unmarked bricks, bricks marked WAU and IXL, chunks of bricks. It's all over the beach along the shore. You also find in some places what's left of the clay banks. They didn't extract all the clay, and this is what is called varved clay. And this was formed in glacial lakes. And the visible layering are like tree rings. They're composed of two periodically repeated layers, and each pair represents 1 year of settling clay particles. The darker ones are the spring and summer months when organic matter was in the water, and the lighter areas are the winter months. And so you can still see them exposed at various parts along the shoreline. And then one unique thing you can find on the shore, something that's found in only a few places in the US, are called clay babies. Clay babies are the result of a unique and really little understood geological process. At its core, clay babies have a little scrap of organic matter, maybe a dead worm drifted into the lake and on the bottom, and then it was eventually coated by calcium in the clay and eventually accreted into these shapes, all kinds of shapes, even flat plates, all kinds of shapes and sizes. But this is typically what's called a clay baby. And there are only a few places in the US where you can find them, and you can find them along the shore at Croton Point. The other thing about Croton Point that I should mention is if you go there, don't miss the Croton Point Nature Center, which is on the northern tip of the point. They have a wonderful collection of Native American artifacts, of clay babies, of all kinds of things relating to the natural history of Croton Point. John Phillips runs the Nature Center, and he is an archaeologist and is a wealth of information about the Native American occupation and the geology of Croton Point and the area. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I appreciate everyone coming, and if anyone has any questions, just let me know.
Mark, thank you so much. If you just stop your screen share,
sure.
We'll go ahead and let everybody get on board. You're all welcome to unmute yourselves. Thank you so much for being such a great audience. Mark, that was fabulous.
Thank you, thank you.
I have so many questions, and it just was so well presented. So I thank you. And just close yourself out. Do end the screen share.
There we go.
There. Okay. And now, does anyone have any questions of Mark? I know Sarah Underhill, and I don't know if she's related, has been on, and I think she had some tech problems because she was with us. Sarah, you here? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I definitely had tech problems as well as arriving a little late, but I'm really glad this happened, and it was recorded, right? So maybe a link can be available. I know a lot of my family members would love to watch this later on, but yeah.
I'd be honored to have any member of the Underhill family see it.
Yeah. No, I'll spread it far and wide. And I mean, I love Croton Point. I first came there not even knowing my family had anything to do with it. I came there for a music festival called the Clearwater Revival back in 1985. And since then, I've just fallen in love with the place, and I've gathered bricks on those beaches. And I just recently, due to that new book that was just published about the history of Croton Point, I found out, I thought IXL bricks were some sort of joke that my great uncles had come up with, but I guess it was a part of a machine that they owned, a brickmaking machine.
Right. Although it did stand for IXL at brickmaking.
Right.
It was sort of a joke. Yes.
Quakers would never have been allowed to brag, and say anything like that. So I thought maybe they had done it in code, but it was whoever made the machine. And I have to say, I have been in the wine cellars many times. I even was there this summer, and I'm sure the local high school kids go there too, because they do try to batten it down. And sometimes I've been taken in there by park personnel to see it, but other times, you go there and the door is actually been jimmied open and you can crawl in.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful, I mean, I love it in there, and the acoustics are wonderful. So uh, it's, yeah, it's a special place. Mark, I have a question for you. At one point we spoke and you said you were looking for a book or a written account of.
Yes.
Did you ever find it yet?
No, this was, this mainly has to do with the flour mills that the Underhill family, that Robert Underhill started, and Abraham Underhill started on the Croton River. And she had some sort of manuscript with her memories of growing up there, and really beautifully written. They're quoted in a Westchester County Historical Society in the bulletin from like an article from like the 1940s from one of the Underhill descendants. Yeah, so one day I still hope some member of the family will turn it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
And
Field Horn is on, and Field, if you want to unmute yourself and show your face. And this also gives me the opportunity to tell all of you who don't know about the Westchester County Historical Society, we have the largest repository of materials related to Westchester's history, the Westchester as a whole. And that includes the Crawbucky tales are in our collection, and we are hoping to reprint them. I also wanted to show you that we have a quarterly journal, and Mark, I hope this becomes an article.
Okay.
And that was actually Field's recommendation, and I hope so also. Our next issue is going to be an article I wrote on the 100th anniversary of the park system that contains a little bit of Croton Point Park history. And I have to laugh because, you know, as an author, I might have spent a little too much attention to the very short-lived activity of the Croton Point Park, which was the Tired Mothers Camp. Always intrigued me, still intrigues me.
Yes.
So Field was on. Yes, Field, if you're still on.
Am I audible?
Yes.
You're audible. And I also want to show, this is the other thing. The Westchester County Historical Society publishes books, and this is one that Field Horn, New York State history historian extraordinaire and native of Westchester, wrote this.
Barbara, I think that's the Panetta book.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my God, you're right. I grabbed the wrong book. Nobody would have known, Field, had you not said something.
Oh, well.
But Field, did you have some questions?
Well, no questions. I think the research is really, really well done. I would like to know a little bit more about land use under the Tellers and or Van Cortlandts, which is harder to tease out.
Yeah.
And also, if you don't know about it, the Braywald papers, which were given to WCHS 2 years ago, has a file or 2 or 3 on Croton Point, because Jim Wood, who donated them, is the great grandson of a cousin of the first Underhill to buy the land.
Yes, I know him. I didn't realize that they were there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a file of correspondence between the family in Mount Kisco and the family at the Point.
Right.
We also have, do you see this book?
Yes.
So this is Field Horn's history of the Sparta area. And we have that at the Jug Tavern of Sparta.
And we're looking for more information about Sparta and the Sparta history. Actually, where Field leaves off up to today, we're hungry for that history. So we'll be contacting you guys. Be great. Thank you.
Of course, that recent history is probably well documented. It's just a matter of digging into public records that I didn't necessarily get into back 50 years ago, 45 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
And maybe there are papers of the Vanderbilt family. I don't know. If the well, we shouldn't be talking about things other than Croton Point.
That's right. That's correct. Yes, let's be
we could go down a long rabbit hole. But, this has been wonderful. And I thank you all so much for joining, but I really, really want to thank Marc. A fabulous presentation. And thank you for giving us your time and all the preparation and giving your time on this Sunday afternoon. We hope you all continue to join us for other programs, Westchester County Historical Society live and virtually, and be in touch with us so we can be in touch with you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc.